All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and I apologize for the disturbances in the video. Um, so today I'm here with Professor Salvatore Babones, who is professor of sociology at the University of Sydney, the author of New Authoritarianism, and a newly inducted member of the Khan Market Gang, I'm told. So why don't we start with, because I do want to talk about your book. I read your book. But before we do that, why don't we start with a bit of housekeeping, because I wanted to know what went wrong in that famous or infamous News Laundry interview.
I don't know that anything went wrong. It was just not. It wasn't an interview. It was a bizarre session in which News Laundry seemed to want to present evidence against me. For me, it was almost like being put on trial and a prosecutor showing you evidence and then asking you for reactions. It was really bizarre. It is the only interview of that sort I've ever had. When I told the journalist that he wasn't really behaving according to ordinary journalistic standards, he emphatically proclaimed that he is not a journalist. So I don't know what to make of that. I think someone told me it may have been because there's some rules in India about journalistic ethics, and by saying he's not a journalist, he can't then be brought up in front of the press council. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was very emphatic that he's not a journalist. And it was a very strange experience. A lot of people told me, Salvatore, why don't you record your interviews? And I will note that I am not recording this one. And the reason I don't record my interviews is that I've done more than 200 interviews. I've done lots of interviews where interviewers were probing or challenging or disagreed with me. I have no problem with that. I've never had this sort of experience before in literally hundreds of interviews. On top of that, I've now gone through News Laundry's previous interviews, and I see nothing in their previous interviews that's along the lines of what they did with me. Again, they're very friendly to some people. They're very confrontational with others. That's fine. I don't mind someone being confrontational. But trying to almost make a documentary film about how evil I am is really something that they haven't done with anyone else, as far as I can tell. They've only done with me, and it was a really strange experience. That's pretty much all I can say about it.
Well, they're technically, I think, a media watch organization, like Media Matters or Right Wing Watch, that sort of organization. So that technically, I don't think that they're journalists or registered as such.
I don't know, but all I know is that I answer all the interview requests, whoever they come from. I always say yes. My assumption is always that the interviews will be simply published in full. I didn't get your written agreement on this, but I assume that our interview will be published as is on your YouTube channel. If it's not going to be, well, maybe I made a second mistake. But look, in the industry, you when you give hundreds of interviews, you don't negotiate written terms in advance. It's just someone calls, a producer calls, says, we'd like you to do an interview. You say yes, you do it. It gets posted on YouTube. That's the way it works in the industry.
But wasn't it published in full? The interview, was it edited?
No. So the interview was first of all not published as recorded. Now, every other interview I've ever done has been published as recorded. This interview was published in full, but not as recorded, by which I mean, instead of publishing the high definition video and audio of the two of us talking to each other as recorded on Zoom, it was published with Sekri's stuff either being reshot or being shot or having a background added and everything in full audio. I was picture in picture on a handheld camera looking at the screen that I was talking on. They dialed down my volume when they didn't want people to hear what I was saying. They dialed up Sekri when they wanted him to talk over me. They put little blinkers on the sides of the video saying wrong, or, I mean, no, it was not published as recorded. It was published, I guess, technically in full, but only on their website. So it was not publicly published. Again, every other interview I've done, I've lost count, but more than 200 online interviews, every single one of those 200 has been published publicly, not for subscribers only. And, anyone who thinks, well, Salvatore, why did you agree? Or Salvatore, it's their material. Once it's their copyright, they can do what they want with it. It's like, well, yeah, but in business, in every business, you just work on the assumption. I mean, when you go to a store and you buy a product off the shelf, I mean, if you buy a carton of milk, you just assume there's no poison in it. You don't ask the store to make a contract with you that this milk is actually milk. It's not. It says milk on the outside. You assume it's milk. You take it home. You drink it. Right. All of business works on this basic approach of trust. It was just bizarre. I mean, there's no other word. There's no other word for it. Well, strange.
I think the problem
unusual. I mean, I guess there are other words for it, but it was very strange.
I think the problem was that it was not in good faith. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with having disagreements, but the problem is those disagreements should be in good faith, that you should allow the other person to, have the dignity of an opinion.
And not only that, but why, I mean, to talk about good faith, why would I, for no compensation, voluntarily give 77 minutes of content to someone for the purpose of putting out highly edited teasers, making fun of me, and then only releasing a highly edited version of the video to their own subscribers without making it publicly available? I mean, there's no incentive. If they had said, Salvatore, let's write a contract. We'd like you to give us your time for free. We're going to make fun of you in a series of teasers, and then we're not going to let anyone see the original footage. And then we're only going to let our subscribers see a highly manipulated version of the video. Of course, I wouldn't sign that contract. But look, it's just for anyone who thinks, well, how could you not sign a contract when you do this? How can you not make a recording? This is just how it's just how business is done. I mean, today alone, I'm doing 4 interviews. And I don't have a press officer. And even if I did, if I sent you a contract form about our interview, you probably wouldn't even do the interview, right? Because you don't have a lawyer. We all look, it's just how it's done. It's how business is done. It was simply bizarre.
Yeah. So talking about your book, latest one, I think, The New Authoritarianism.
Well, my latest book is on Australian universities, but it's probably not of interest to anyone in India. But my 2018 book, which is now 5 years ago, well, 4.5. I mean, it was published 4.5 years ago. 2018, yeah, is called The New Authoritarianism: Trump Populism and the Tyranny of Experts. I haven't. It's now, I mean, I now wrote it 6 years ago. So if you want to talk about specific passages, you'll have to prompt me. But the basic idea of the book is
the basic, we'll talk about the basic idea, but first I want you to, I want the definitions to be clear, because you define, because you have very specific definitions, for instance, of progressivism, liberalism, and conservatism, which you characterize as a 3.
So these words, so words for politics are used very loosely by most people. When in doubt, I've tried to go back to the Oxford English Dictionary. And so it's not my idiosyncratic definitions. I rely very heavily on the Oxford English Dictionary just because I want consensus definitions. And the Oxford English Dictionary is a descriptive dictionary, means it's describing how the word is generally used in the language, and it's an etymological dictionary describing how it first appeared and where the word comes from. So the key word that I've talked about in the book was authoritarianism. And authoritarianism, I don't have the OET. Again, I didn't realize you mainly wanted to talk about this 5-year-old book. I'm very happy to talk about it. I just haven't prepped it. So I don't have the definition handy at my fingertips, but the heart of the definition of authoritarianism is governance by, or legitimized by, reference to authority. That is, the root of authoritarianism is not author. I'm a person who writes. The root of it is authority. That is, people who are recognized, established authorities should be those who govern. And thus, the New Authoritarianism book made clear that what we saw in America in the era of Trump was a new authoritarianism that could not be traced to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I don't mind if people have bad things to say about Donald Trump. There's lots bad you could say about him. But, don't call him a Nazi. He's clearly not a Nazi. Don't call him a communist. He's clearly not a communist. Don't call him an authoritarian. He clearly doesn't respect authority. And you can't, and the punchline of the book was, you can't be an authoritarian when the only authority you respect is yourself. Now, if you want to call him, selfish, self-centered, narcissistic, I don't have any complaints about that. Calling him authoritarian, I think, was just a misuse of the term. And I think real authoritarians have very different modes of governance, and real authoritarians probably would not have much respect for someone like Donald Trump. Now, as for the three traditions in Anglo-American politics, that's not something original to me, but I think it's something that was historically clear, but has been much more forgotten in recent years, which is that Anglo-American politics are not in a left-right scale. That left-right version of politics derived from the French Revolution and the sitting of the Royalists and the Jacobins in the French Assembly. And in the Anglo-American world, we have neither Royalists, that is, we don't have traditionalists who want to see the church and the king, remain the foundation of society going back, because those are traditions going back hundreds of years, nor do we have Jacobins who want to see an activist Republican government take over the means of production. Jacobins are often thought of as proto-communists. Certainly they're socialists. Calling them communists, we could, again, debate these terms, but certainly socialist in orientation and statist in orientation. These two orientations, communist and royalist, don't exist in Anglo-American politics. They do exist in continental Europe. Now, they're not as important now in continental Europe as they were 100 years ago. But if you go back just 100 years, maybe 110 years, just before World War I, the primary dimension of German politics before World War I was royalists, people who supported the emperor, and communists, people who were anti-religion and anti-imperial. Okay, same thing in Russia. White Russians, red Russians, right, left continuum. To some extent, the same thing in France, though less so. France had 100 years of revolution at that point. Anglo-American politics, instead, has generally had three interest groups, or three social groups in their politics. And these are reflected in the three traditional British parties, the 19th century British parties. The Tories, that is the landed conservatives, people who were tied to the land and landlordship and the old economy based on the land. So the Tories. The Liberals, that is the middle class, people associated with the middle class professions and with the rise of the middle class. And labor, that is those associated with, obviously, workers in the new industries. And that basic political constellation of the old aristocracy landowners, the liberal middle class, and the laborite workers, that constellation also existed in the United States in the 18th century. No surprise, the United States arose as a British colony, and then has, I think, dominated American politics for the last 200 years. The difference is that in America, we've evolved, and I am American, in America, we've evolved a two-party system. So those three social classes have been squeezed into two parties. And again, our rhetoric reflects this. We've always talked in America about liberal Republicans versus conservative Republicans. We've also talked in America about liberal Democrats versus progressive Democrats. If you want to see this in America, we have the establishment wing of the Republican Party, the Lynn Cheneys of the world versus the Donald Trumps of the world. If you want to see it in the Democratic Party, you have the Joe Bidens and Hillary Clintons of the world versus the Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world. The liberals in both parties, and both parties have had liberal wings, are fundamentally able to work together. And that's why we do see a lot of wistfulness for a lost era of politics among liberals in America. Oh, why can't Republicans and Democrats work together? And that wistfulness is this old alliance of establishment liberals across the two parties, whereas the conservative wing of the Republican Party has never wanted to work with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Okay, so that's the basic layout. I would say the political sociology layout of the United States. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a political sociologist. So political scientists generally teach about party systems, whereas as a political sociologist, I'm much more interested in the groups behind the parties. And I'd love to get into the political sociology of India as well, which has interesting dimensions. But that's to put the terminology out there. Those are the basic dimensions underlying my new authoritarianism book.
Since we're talking about, say, the expert class, I think that there are multiple other ideologies which are quite influential in the United States and which are constantly being paid lip service to. So, for
Like what?
instance, say neoliberalism or libertarianism, which
Yeah.
is, does not feature in the two. I don't think it's represented in any of the two parties, though there are people like Ron Paul, for instance, would claim to be a libertarian, but not exactly influential even in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And the views of the libertarians, let's say, is partly aligned with the so-called progressives. They would say that, okay, the minarchist type Robert Nozick types would claim that, okay, I believe in the open border or immigration, and all of these are progressive policies, but at the same time they would also be in support of capitalism. So how would you place these streams of thought which the expert class does believe in?
The expert class does or does not believe in, sorry?
A lot of expert class people, because it is the expert class after all who formulates these theories. So there is a stream of thought represented in the expert.
Look, there are heterodox views in every group at all times, but the American expert class is, I think, overwhelmingly and fundamentally establishment liberals. I mean, there may be a Rand Paul, an occasional Rand Paul out there, but Rand Paul is not someone who's embraced by, let me just say, if we were to do a mental experiment and in our minds think, if we took every major academic association, American Historical Association, American Sociological Association, American Political Science Association, plus the professional associations, American Medical Association, American Bar Association, plus the big Wall Street firms, plus what else for them to the core of the middle class? That should be plus Chamber of Commerce. And we were to take this broad segment of upper middle class America and ask, would they endorse a Ron Paul? No. I mean, there's always going to be people who have atypical views in any group of millions of people. But fundamentally, the American expert class, or if you want to call it the middle class professions, to be more sociological about it, are overwhelmingly establishment liberal in orientation. I don't think that's a very controversial assertion. Of course, people who disagree with the assertion are welcome to disagree, but I think it's a pretty well accepted idea. Versus conservatism is much more concentrated among the devout religious. It's much more concentrated in the South and West as opposed to the metropolitan cities. And progressivism is much more centered among the non-religious, much more centered among socially excluded ethnic minorities, and much more concentrated in the major metropolitan areas. And I think that basic sociological three-part sociological breakdown is, well, I don't have empirical evidence. That is, I have empirical evidence. I don't have systematic statistical evidence. I can't give you an actual study because no one will give me, the $2 million to do the survey that would have the right questions. But I think that is the fundamental political sociology of America. The surveys, by the way, the reason I don't do quantitative work on this is that most of the survey work that has been done on political attitudes is so committed to the idea of a left-right scale that the questions are actually phrased in that way. And it's very difficult to get data from political science surveys that doesn't pre-assume that we're placing people on a left-right scale. So the questions themselves ask people to put themselves on a left-right scale. I can't get statistical data about political sociology from those kinds of questions.
Would you agree that the liberal establishment class, that there is a consensus among the establishment class in general, and that consensus was maybe is threatened by populists, like
Yes,
Trump or
very much so.
Sanders? And what is that consensus?
So the consensus, first of all, was threatened by Trump. It was threatened by Bernie Sanders. I think it was very clear that the Democratic Party establishment came down like a ton of bricks on the Bernie Sanders campaigns in both 2016 and 2020. And it historically came down on figures like William Jennings Bryan. I spent a lot of time in the book on William Jennings Bryan in 1896 and the populist challenge in 1896. And I spent a lot of time on that because I viewed the Trump phenomenon really as a phenomenon we've seen repeatedly in American history. When the establishment stops providing policy options that people want, populists arise to challenge that establishment. And it happened with Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. It happened with William Jennings Bryan in the 1890s. To some extent, it happened with Huey Long in the 1930s. And it's happened in the 2010s with Donald Trump and both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Both of those phenomena were a populist rebellion against the choices they were being given by the two major parties. The political establishment. I'm sorry, I missed the second half of the question.
I was talking about the consensus. What exactly is the consensus?
Oh, yeah, the consensus. So there's a broad consensus among middle-class professionals that what's good for middle-class professionals is good for the country. So we've seen a broad consensus in the U.S. around low taxes for upper-middle earners. We've seen a broad consensus around having very low taxes on investment income. We've seen a real complacency about rising inequality. Inequality has risen dramatically in the United States, and I've done a lot of work on inequality in the past. I'd be happy to talk about that, but risen dramatically since 1972 or 1968, around 1970 in the U.S. There's a broad consensus on having a large military. So historically, the U.S. has had a very small military, and the U.S. has historically been isolationist. The middle-class liberal political establishment has embraced liberal internationalism and has discredited anyone who would question interventionist liberal internationalism as the default position for the U.S. On social issues, the liberal political establishment, of course, is very socially open-minded. So the destigmatization of homosexuality, now the destigmatization of transsexuality, the acceptance of atheism, all of these are acceptance of drug use. So the liberal political establishment has broadly accepted that recreational drug use is acceptable, and so has promoted the decriminalization of drugs. All of these are kind of the sort of policies that the liberal political establishment has embraced today. But there's no one constant set of policies. The constant is the political sociology. That same liberal political establishment in the 1860s wanted the end of slavery, wanted restrictions on the sale of alcohol, wanted women's suffrage, so women being allowed to vote. Those are the big three causes of the 1860s. And, the causes change over time. But the same newspapers, the same magazines, I mean, literally, Harper's, The Atlantic, the New York Times, and the Washington Post were all founded in that same era of the first big wave of the Great Awakening in the US in the 1850s, 1860s, all as liberal establishment papers. And they all have the same subscriber base today, sociologically speaking, that they had 150 years ago. The views of that subscriber base have changed over time. But the fact that these publications reflect the views of their subscriber base and that they tend to have the same sorts of subscribers, that's the constant.
I think Noam Chomsky has done brilliant work on the consensus of the establishment in terms of journalism and newspaper and manufacturing consent.
Yeah, he's done so from a progressive, progressive perspective.
From a progressive, but I wouldn't describe him as the establishment.
No. He's a progressive. He's not a member of the liberal establishment. He's a progressive critic of the establishment. He's much more a Bernie Sandersite than a Hillary Clintonite.
He would describe himself as a liberal socialist. So, the way I see it is that this, your argument is that this threatens democracy or democratic opinions. And I would...
Not the existence of the establishment, the authoritarianism
yeah.
of the establishment threatens. And I want to be very clear, I'm a liberal. And I want to be very clear, I'm not opposed to the existence of a liberal political establishment. I just want to see that liberal political establishment acknowledge the primacy of democracy over the moral certitude of their own views.
Okay, so what would you say when it comes to, because the expert class, I see a dwindling support, dwindling in the support for the expert class. People are losing their hope, with the COVID policies or the vaccines and all of that thing. So what's happening from a far perspective is that there is no respect for the expert class at all. And I think that is also a danger that needs addressing.
Yeah. There's less respect for the expert class. There's certainly not no respect for the expert class. Look, I think that there's more respect for experts when experts are modest. So, for example, if let's take COVID as an example, if the American expert establishment had come out and said, we're not sure that masks will be effective, but this is a really potentially serious virus. We're not, there's a lot of uncertainty, but people could die. And we recommend masking even outdoors, all the time, just to be safe and to be cautious. I think there would have been much more willingness among people to comply with that request. However, when we were told, and we were told by none less than Anthony Fauci, that, masks will prevent the transmission of the virus, and we were told, you must wear the mask or else, many people rebelled against that because it just didn't seem to be true. Same thing with the vaccines. We were told that the vaccines would prevent spread of the virus. Well, when people knew people who'd been vaccinated, who then still got the virus, and when people knew people who had been vaccinated and still spread it to their families, then that's so distrust for the expert class, because the expert class has been so unequivocal in its claims. This is absolutely true. You must trust us. You must trust the experts. Same on climate change. I mean, I've taught for 20 years about the dangers of global warming, and in my sociology classes, and how we have to take a more precautionary approach to the threat posed by global warming. What I don't teach is that we're in a climate catastrophe and that there will be mass starvation within this decade if we don't act now. I don't teach that because it's not true. And the problem is when you teach that kind of alarmism, and then you get through the 2030s and there's not mass starvation. And I guarantee you, there is not going to be mass starvation in the 2030s. There's a massive world glut of food, and it's not at all clear that global warming will reduce food output. Global warming might actually increase food. I mean, it's very uncertain. So when the expert class insists that you believe it, well, then any one bit of evidence that's contrary pokes a hole in that, right? Because the expert class is not willing to be humble enough to accept that, the limits of its knowledge, there are very serious limits on its knowledge. It has best advice, but ultimately, please seek advice from many people. Think about it. You have to make your own decision. Because in a democracy, we make our own decisions. People can vote on it. And if the American people or the Indian people or anyone else want to vote to exploit every ounce of coal in the ground and burn it without regard for the future, they can vote to do that, right? You can't tell them, you naughty people, don't vote for coal. You have to persuade them. And persuasion is really not done best by scolding people. Persuasion's done best by open and honest conversation. At least that's what I believe. And I think the expert class has compromised its integrity by essentially insisting on each issue after issue, trust us, we're the experts.
I would argue that there are examples where perhaps we don't need to have conversations. For instance, education. Do we really want to create a curriculum based on a democratic vote? Do we want to create a curriculum? For instance, if we had to create a curriculum in 2008, then the majority of the people would vote that evolution shouldn't be taught at schools, because as the Pew Research poll says, that a lot of 40 to 50% of Americans think that creationism is true and evolution is not true. So you wouldn't want that to happen. There were attempts for it to happen, and it was the expert class which stopped it. It was supported by the Republicans. Even George Bush said that intelligent design should be taught at school. But it was the expert class finally who stopped it. If we had put that to vote, we wouldn't have had a desirable outcome.
So first of all, a vote is not a conversation, and I don't think that everything we do in the classroom should be put to a vote of the general public. That said, I do think there should be a lot more general public input into what we vote in the classroom, what we say in the classroom. That is, it's my responsibility as a teacher in a democratic country that's supported by the voters. I mean, I don't make my money as an entrepreneur going out and the sweat of my brow. I'm supported by the state. If I'm supported by the state in a democratic state, I'm answerable to the people, which means I should be humbly going to the people, and I mean that, humbly going to them and say, please, hardworking voter, please support my research. Please support my teaching. Yes, I know you don't like what I'm teaching about evolution, but it's really important, because if our students don't learn about evolution, they're not going to be very competent biologists. They're not going to make good policy recommendations when a virus comes around, because they won't understand the evolutionary pressures that create viruses. It's up to us to humbly ask the voters to support us, to bring them along. I mean, dare I say, to educate them, to have that conversation with voters. And this idea of education goes all the way back well before John Dewey to the origins of the American progressive education movement, which I very much support the progressive education movement, at least in its first 100 years or so of evolution, with the idea that in a democracy, in a democracy, it's not, we're not in charge, the public's in charge. And it's our responsibility to educate the public as to why they should do these things that maybe they disagree with.
But wouldn't you say we already have science popularizers? How exactly is that any different? I think we're already doing that.
It's a difference of attitude. So in those US states where teaching evolution has become controversial, there has been a determined effort to, I'll just use the phrase, shove it down people's throats, to insist, you must do this or else. And now evolution is an old debate. We can see this now, as I'm not really up on the evolution debates in the US. They were 20 years ago, and honestly, I didn't prep them for this conversation. But if we could talk about the trans debates and the sexuality in schools debates that are very current, happening right now, in Florida, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, these sort of things in the US. When we have teachers going on TikTok saying that they're going to, undermine parents' viewpoints in the classroom, essentially saying there are kids now, ha ha ha. Of course, parents get angry and upset. Now, if you go to parents and you say, there are real problems with homophobia in the world. We don't want anyone to feel excluded. Look at these, nightclub shootings that have occurred. Look at, the violence that's occurred against people for their sexuality. We really need in schools to teach children that there are multiple forms of sexuality, and just to be understanding about it. Well, okay, I don't think there will be a lot of complaints. But when we see in children being assigned books in young grades that portray homosexual sexuality, when we would never assign those children's books portraying heterosexual sexuality. I mean, children's books don't have adults kissing in them, right? Never have had adults kissing in them. But now they have to have gay men kissing, even though they've never had men and women kissing, right? So that pushing it on parents, that, and saying so in a way that is essentially saying, you have no control. We're the experts, we'll do the teaching. I think it's not surprising that parents in both Virginia and in Florida have reacted and have said, no, actually, we're the voters, and we can fire you. We can change the school system. We can decide what's taught. And, but that reaction only occurs when the expert class loses its humility and instead stands on an absolute idealism. Now, should we stand on an absolute idealism? There's always a question. I mean, everyone pretty much agrees, we don't accept the Holocaust. We don't accept slavery. There's some things that now everyone agrees, but, go back 80 years, the American liberal expert class was not unified on opposition to anti-Semitism. Go back 150, 180 years, it was not unified on opposition to slavery. There were liberal apologias for slavery. I don't endorse them. I'm just saying that, we should recognize that our views as liberal intellectuals have changed. And if our views have changed, it doesn't show much humility in our class if we say, no, now we've arrived at the truth, which you must accept. Because if we accept that the liberal expert class can define the truth now, why don't we accept that the liberal expert class was able to define the truth in the 1930s? The liberal expert class didn't know the truth then, but now they do. I think we should always be humble. We should be promoting our views. We should be arguing for them, robustly. But I think democracy requires humility, and it requires humility most of all on those who have the most authority.
But certainly, consider, for instance, the bill, when you have a legislation dictating what should or shouldn't be taught. Well, that is in direct violation of the rights of the schools. It is up to the schools to decide what shouldn't be taught.
Schools don't have rights. The people have rights.
The people have rights.
Schools have responsibilities. I'm sorry. I know that this may be a difference in viewpoint, and your viewpoint may be legitimately different from mine. But in my view, no, schools don't have rights. The people, the voters have rights. Individuals have rights. But practically, from a sociological standpoint, the voters will only organize around an issue like what's taught in schools if pushed to an extreme. They're not going to do, ordinarily, it's just below the radar screen.
How much of it is due to an actual extreme versus, let's say, rhetoric of the, political class or the political commentators or whatever? For instance, consider the example of the election, people saying that the election, there was a voter fraud in the election denial thing. So I think that happened because it was the people in power. It was the political commentators, the expert class, who were telling that this is what happened. So the people thought, okay, we have to protest against that. So this happened because of the influence directly of the people in power. This did not happen spontaneously because people believed that there was voter fraud.
So let's get to elections in a moment. Let me say one final thing on the Don't Say Gay bill. If you look at the bill itself is quite reasonable. The bill itself essentially says you can't teach sexuality before third grade at all, and you can't teach explicit sexuality before, I think it's seventh grade. Doesn't say you can't doesn't say you must only teach heterosexuality, nothing like that. It's just sexuality doesn't belong in schools. It's a reasonable bill. I think we got to the point of needing that reasonable bill because experts, that is teachers, were abusing their autonomy to do things that really angered parents. With the elections, there have been complaints about election integrity and election fraud. That's a standing item in America. It only has become such a huge issue for two reasons. First reason, for lack of a better term, Trump derangement syndrome. Second reason, January 6th. And I'm happy to talk about January 6th. January 6th was an event that either could or could not have happened had there been proper security. We wouldn't be talking about it. As far as allegations of election fraud, allegations that elections were stolen, look, the 2020 election was stolen. right? I mean, George Bush's brother stopped the counting of votes in Florida, a counting of votes that was almost certainly going to lead to an Al Gore victory. Well, we all, like alleging that election was stolen is, I mean, I was teaching that election was stolen in my classes, and we were going through the data, and I was using it as an example in social research methods. Hillary Clinton, Fox News, Tucker Carlson loves playing this clip of all the times Hillary Clinton said that the 2016 election was stolen and the result was illegitimate. So allegations that elections were stolen or were illegitimate are par for the course in American politics. People may not like it. That rhetoric is simply normal. It's only abnormal if you don't like the people who are saying it. And I don't have much sympathy for the, we've never seen this before, lack of historical perspective. Now, January 6th was unique. If you want to talk about January 6th, I'm happy to. But the allegations of a stolen election, I mean, we can go to many elections. I mean, there are allegations that the 1992 election was stolen because of the involvement of Ross Perot and how a billionaire changed the course of American elections by, inappropriately intervening. I mean, so this is a standing item. I mean, Watergate in 1972, the allegation that John F. Kennedy stole the 1960 election through vote rigging in Texas. We can just go on and on with this.
So I think there is a qualitative difference between saying that the election is stolen after the fact, when, because Clinton said it in a event in a closed auditorium, versus Trump constantly pushing it around. Because you would expect after, the election results are announced for the candidates to congratulate each other. This is what normally happens in a democracy. This is what has happened. In the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election, you had Clinton congratulate Trump, and you had her accept the results of the election. Trump never did that. So there is a lot of difference. He never congratulated Joe Biden. He never accepted the results of the election. He did not attend the inauguration ceremony, and he still...
Well, I don't think he was wanted at the inauguration ceremony. But look, I'm not defending Donald Trump's behavior. Donald Trump should have accepted the results of the election once the states had submitted their votes. Even if it was stolen, the fact is that we have a federal system in the United States, and even if states wrongly and illegally certify their votes, as many of us have alleged, not just me, the Congressional Black Caucus alleged that in the year 2000, Florida illegally certified its votes and it was an illegal election. Fine, we can believe it was illegal, but once it happens, it happens. That is, in our constitutional system, the states are sovereign in certifying their votes, no matter what shenanigans go on in the state to do that. Once the state certifies it, and Trump should have accepted that. I think Trump was absolutely wrong in not accepting that. But we were talking about, are people persuaded in theories of election conspiracy? Are they persuaded by the experts, or are these organic in some way? Now, of course, we can't know. We won't resolve that. If you're asking my opinion is that they're organic. That Americans, a large percentage of Americans believe that UFOs have been visiting the U.S. and the Air Force have been covering it up. It's simply not out of character in my country for large numbers of people to believe that they lost, their side lost because the election was stolen. The important thing, I think, is that we don't see any armed rebellion. We don't see any mass civil disobedience. Even people who believe the election was stolen pay their taxes and don't go shooting up government offices. They don't join rebellions, right? And I think that's the strength of the system, that, yeah, whatever people may say, when it comes to their behavior, we all accept the constitutional system.
Well, it's an interesting point, I would say, which has to do with the stability of democracy. And I think a lot of that happens because people do see the state as having the potential to control the monopoly of violence, the potential to control any outbreak of violence. That is obvious. But at the same time, so contrast this with, say, the BLM riots that happened in the aftermath of COVID.
Yeah.
What are the differences that you think? Why did the state break down then, and why did it not break down in this scenario?
The state generally in the United States, the policy on policing for the last at least 50 years, I don't know when it started, the policy has been to let protests burn themselves out. That is, that more violence is caused by restoring order than would be caused by allowing a certain level of disorder. Now, many people are vehemently opposed to that approach to policing. I'm not very sympathetic to it, but it is a consensus among law enforcement that it's better to contain violence. So, for example, during the Obama administration, there was an ultra-right-wing group that seized control of a federal land in the West, and literally armed group with assault rifles, and they didn't move in and shoot everybody. Instead, they just cordoned it off, waited for it to settle down, and I don't know what the legal result has been. Compare that to, there was a tragedy in Waco, Texas, when the FBI sent in, an armored SWAT team to break up a hostage situation. I don't remember how many people were killed, but Waco became a sign of, no, we can't have this kind of hyper-aggressive policing. Instead, we should stand back. So if we go to the elephant in the room, January 6th, if you watch the videos of the January 6th protesters, when Ashley Babbitt, the woman, one person who was shot and killed in the January 6th protest was killed by police. If you look at her, when she and her colleagues are trying to break down the doors, and this was not the doors of the Capitol, they were internal doors inside a hallway in the Capitol. When they were trying to break down the doors, literally standing next to her in the video, as she's trying to get into the door, are two heavily armed policemen with assault rifles and helmets, just standing there. They weren't trying to stop her. They weren't doing anything, because the approach to policing in the U.S. in general is, let them into the building, let them do what they want, prosecute them afterwards. That's the way to reduce violence. Now, of course, January 6th has been thoroughly politicized. I think the reason we have not seen the thousands of hours of TV footage from the Capitol, I mean, remember, the January 6th committee has spent 2 years investigating the January 6th occupation and has not released the video footage of it. And I think the reason they don't want to release the video footage is that probably the Capitol Police followed, except for the one policeman who shot Ashley Babbitt, the rest of the Capitol Police basically followed standard procedure, which is let protesters run around, take pictures of them, get their personal information, prosecute them later. Whether that's a good or a bad approach to policing is for criminologists to judge and for the public to judge. But that's the general approach, and it keeps a country like the U.S. If the U.S. and India have one thing in common, it's a propensity to riot. It keeps the U.S. Less. It certainly saves lives at the expense of property damage, and that's probably a good thing.
Well, I think that this approach might apply when there are non-violent protesters. It would certainly not apply when there are people, because there were people within the Capitol building, for instance, there were people, the senators were there, and there was real threat to their lives from the mob, because you have no idea what is going to happen when there is a mob. So it was a responsibility of the police officers to, ensure that the mob is kept out.
That's one point of view. Look, I personally don't view the lives of senators as being any more valuable than the lives of small store owners. And we saw in Minneapolis with Black Lives Matter that the police just evacuated from the center of Minneapolis and let people shoot, loot, pillage, burn down federal courthouses, burn down police. I mean, literally, in Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter protesters burned down a police station. The police simply evacuated their own police station and let the protesters burn down the police station. Several people were murdered in the free zone, more people were murdered in the free zone of Minneapolis than were murdered in the capital occupation. I'm not saying it's good or bad. Again, I'm not a criminologist, and I haven't thought deeply about the implications of policing. But as a comparative social scientist, I say, well, you know, if we have these policies in one place, the capital occupation, whatever the problems it posed and the unique problems it posed by being at the capital, and there are unique problems, I'm happy to talk about them. The simple fact is they were much less violent than other events, Black Lives Matter being the obvious comparison, but we could go back to other protests, violent protests in the US. They were much less violent than other events in which there was a much more hands-off approach. And at the Capitol, there seems to have been difference of opinion. As I said, the very woman who was shot in the face as she tried to enter that door was trying to enter it with two heavily armed police officers standing right next to her, not trying to stop her. So clearly there was not a consensus among the people policing the Capitol as to the importance of preventing entry into that doorway.
I wanted to present you with a hypothesis, and I think this is something that you're perhaps familiar with, which is a hypothesis that Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein bring in the bell curve. And their argument essentially is bearing their central argument on the race stuff, is that the elites is rapidly segregating themselves by disassociating with the people. So what's happening is slow and slowly they're creating their own little silos, and they think that what matters to them, the things that are of value to them, are of the same value as the rest of the world. So do you think this is the reason perhaps why the expert class is so disassociated with the working class people?
It's closely associated with rising inequality. Rising inequality has led to effective residential segregation, in the sense that if you look at any small American town 50 or 80 years ago, and you'll typically find the high school in that town you'll find that around the high school in that town, it'll be in the area where you'll find the homes that were formerly the homes of the bankers, the doctors, the lawyers, and you'll find names of the leading banker in town will be the name of the high school, or we'll have a name on the gymnasium or the football field or something like that. Because small towns in America 50 or 100 years ago, the banker, the lawyer, the doctor all lived in town alongside the factory worker, the store owner, all lived in the same town. Now we see much more segregation. We see much more segregation because the middle-class professions have become globalized, but also very much more, metropolitanized. And that middle-class professionals are located in clusters. If you think of Silicon Valley, for example, they're located in clusters where they work together. The person who is the teller at your local bank branch is not a banker. Right, is not the person making a high salary as a banker. The person making a high salary as a banker is in New York or Charlotte or Boston. The actual workers in local banks are low-wage earners, just like the other people in the local areas. So we've seen this massive shift in residential patterns driven by rising inequality or I wouldn't say driven by, accompanied by rising inequality, to where if you go to Martha's Vineyard, as we had this politicization of Martha's Vineyard with the migrant issue, everyone in Martha's Vineyard is a millionaire. I mean, they love the small town atmosphere, but the people who create the small town atmosphere, for the most part, commute to the small town. That is the store. The owner of the cute little ice cream shop in Martha's Vineyard typically doesn't live in Martha's Vineyard because they can't possibly afford to. The owner of the ice cream shop lives somewhere else and takes the ferry in, right? So that transition from having actual operating local towns to a world where we have segregated communities based on income has led to a real disconnect, a social disconnect. People who are members, upper middle class professionals, are unlikely to have fellow parents in the classes where their children are who are factory workers, who are fast food workers. The fast food worker kids are in one school, The upper middle class professionals kids are in another school, and they don't interact. And so, yes, that creates, there's very little awareness, I think, on both sides of people's lived reality, because, if you're a high power corporate lawyer and you go to a parent teacher night at your local school, everyone else is an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor. You're not going to run into, the so-and-so works at McDonald's, right? Or so-and-so's parents, work at a factory, or so-and-so's parents clean, are maids who clean offices at night. They're in different schools. They used to be in the same schools. And so that segregation, I believe, has probably led to this greater disconnect in lived experience.
So I understand we're running out of time, but I have a lot to talk about. So I hope we can do it sometime again.
Sure.
But I wanted to talk about polarization that has happened in the American society, in Indian society, in a lot of, the societies where the populist movement is gaining traction. So along with that comes a clear polarization. So what we're witnessing now in the universities, let's say, is a form of rigid dogmatism. You can call it wokeism or whatever.
Sure.
But that rigid dogmatism has come because of the polarized event that has happened right now. And this polarization has happened pretty late, because in 2016, let's say, Trump, there is a disconnect between policy and rhetoric. So Trump, for instance, in 2016, said that he's in support of universal healthcare. When he came to power, discarded that policy. He literally called out these Ted Cruz of the world, the establishment wing in the GOP platform for their support of the war on terror, which, it was great to see Republicans cheering this guy who's calling out the war on terror. But at the same time, his policies into foreign policy, though, were better than his predecessor. They were not ideal in any sense, and not something that can be called non-interventionist entirely. So you see a disconnect between policy and ideas. And I think that disconnect is perhaps seeping into the universities, and it has created a platform where the elites in the universities only want their ideas to be discussed, because the rest of the ideas are threatening, and they're very intolerant towards the other ideas. And how do you see that polarization happening? Because I think that polarization did not happen before, because there was a consensus. Now that consensus is broken, what next?
First of all, I want to be clear. There are many questions. Well, first of all, there are many questions inside the statement you just made. First, the universities. Universities have become dogmatic. Now, universities have always been dogmatic places, going back to Plato, right? So this is nothing new. But I think it is fair to say that the degree of dogmatism has probably risen, that there's a lot more groupthink. And, I think Jonathan Haidt and his group studying viewpoint diversity, have really hit the nail on the head there, that there has just been a reduction in viewpoint diversity, which has allowed people who used to recognize that their views were only one among many to now think that, no, their views are correct. Why? Because 95% of the people around them share the same views. And there's not the same need to compromise on, there's not the same need to engage with the fact that other people may disagree with you. Now, I personally have seen that because I see the difference between academic writing when I've written for academic journals, which I found my colleagues doing peer reviews to be extremely dogmatic and narrow-minded, versus when I write for, say, Foreign Affairs Magazine, Foreign Policy Magazine, Quadrant Magazine, where I have to engage in a debate with a broader segment of intellectual society for whom the fact that you're a professor doesn't give you any special authority. I mean, when I'm publishing in a magazine alongside former prime ministers, top lawyers and judges, top doctors, they don't think, oh, wow, Salvatore, you're a professor, you must be right. They're very full of themselves as well. And we all have to come. That's why I think there's a much greater richness of intellectual debate in these sort of high-profile magazines than you find in academic journals these days. Whether that's related to polarization, I'm not sure, because usually when we talk about polarization, we're not so much talking about intellectuals versus society. That's more an issue of the populist revolt against the expert class. If I think, for example, of Donald Trump versus Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that's highly polarized, because these are but neither of them is part of that larger intellectual establishment. Look, consensus politics have historically been driven by members of the establishment in both major parties in the US or in Australia or in the UK, having a general agreement among themselves, what we might in a sexist way call a gentleman's agreement, that certain issues are off the table. In Australia, for example, immigration is off the table. Polite society does not allow you to question Australia's immigration program. It just has to be. Other issues that are off the table, high taxes on the wealthy. You know what? That's not on the table, right? It's not going to be discussed. Neither party is going to take it up in Australia. And I think same, in the US, there are issues that the establishment class, which is primarily a middle-class liberal establishment class, simply won't allow to have on the table. When they do that successfully, they stifle debate and people go away from politics. So up until 2016, America had low and declining levels of voter turnout. And most political scientists, if you ask them in 2010, would have told you voter turnout is at all-time lows and is only going to get lower because we live in a post-political society. People don't care about politics. There were all these books about post-politics. Well, what happened in 2016? Politics came back. And since 2016, we've seen record levels of turnout in the US at the same level as the last time we had record turnout, the 2010s. I'm sorry, 1910s. We've gone back 110, 120 years in terms of voter turnout, and in a good way gone back, because suddenly we have polarized politics. So are polarized politics bad? Personally, I don't think so. I think it's really good to have polarization in a democracy, because then you get clear viewpoints being expressed and voters are highly energized, highly engaged. Of course, you get a lot more ill feelings. You get a lot more people saying nasty things and being unpleasant. But you get vibrant, serious political debate, and you get real choices. And I don't think fundamentally you can have democracy without having choices. If there are no choices in the ballot, if the establishment agrees broadly on a consensus of policies, why have elections in the first place? You may get different people, but you're just going to get the same policies.
Well, in India, that hasn't always been the case, because in India, the voter turnout has always been good. And unlike in, say, other developing countries, it is the poor who have always gone to vote more than the rich, unlike the United States. Yeah. So I want to end this by asking you about what do you think about the future of democracy in India and the world in the face of populist movements?
I get so tired of all of the democracy in danger pornography that has been going on forever. I mean, if American democracy had died even a fraction of the times I've been told it would die just in my lifetime, never mind, I go back and read books from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s talking about the death of democracy. Look, democracy is alive, well, and very healthy. And democracy is self-corrective. Populist movements, like we saw with 2016 in the United States, populist movements, like I guess you could say we've seen with the rise of the BJP in the 2010s in India, populist movements reinvigorate democracy. They may not always lead to good policy. And this is something I constantly push with my students. I ask them, would you rather live in a world that has the policies you prefer, even if it's not democratic, if it's platonic, dictatorial, a platonic guardian system? Or would you rather live in a democracy, but the democracy may vote for things you don't like? In general, 2-to-1, my students prefer the Platonic dictatorship. Now, the only thing that keeps democracy vibrant is the fact that they can't agree on what policies they want. And so the intellectual class, the political class, the middle class, whatever term we want to give it, has to go to the voters because it can't agree what policy said it wants, and the voters get to decide. Now, when that political class does agree among itself what the policies are going to be, democracy suffers. It suffers through a lack of choices. It suffers because people lose interest in it. It suffers because elections are no longer fought on the policies. Instead, they get fought on personalities. They get fought on patronage. But policies no longer matters if there's a policy consensus. Populism, by sweeping away this consensus, reinvigorates politics. My dream election for 2016 would have been Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders.
Same.
Then we would have had an absolute crystal clear policy set where people could choose what they want. Instead, we had Donald Trump versus democracy, right? With the Clinton camp essentially implying that if you vote for Donald Trump, democracy is over. We saw the same thing in 2020. Instead of having Trump versus Sanders again, we had Trump versus Biden with the same rhetoric. Trump has a policy set. Biden is offering you democracy. And I think that really doesn't do much for democracy. What really helps democracy, and same thing in India with, is it Narendra Modi versus, is it BJP versus Congress? Is it BJP versus Aam Aadmi Party? Or is it BJP versus, democracy? And if you don't vote for, if you vote for Narendra Modi, you're somehow voting against democracy. I think that kind of rhetoric cheapens democracy. I did a little video offering my free policy advice to Rahul Gandhi. And I told him, look, stop with all this, vilification of Narendra Modi. You can't win by vilifying someone who has an 80% approval rating. Stop all this about saying, oh, the economy is terrible, because look, whatever everyone always thinks the economy is terrible, but an economy growing at 7%, it's just not credible. Offer people a policy, right? Instead of saying, you vote for me because the world is ending, say, vote for me because I'll give you this policy set. And I suggested, VAT reform, you get rid of value-added taxes, and I said, in desperation, I said, if you can't think of anything else, offer to build more aircraft carriers. Congress is the party of aircraft carriers. People love aircraft carriers. And it was a joke, but it was a joke with a serious message, which was that democracy operates best when major parties offer clear policy alternatives, and then people can go to the menu and say, I want this or I want that. And we have to remember that most people's total engagement with politics is a few minutes a week. Right? They need clear choices, and democracy works best when we have clear choices. I think democracy is very robust, is very healthy in India and the United States, around the world. I'm not one of these who's pessimistic about democracy. I am very bullish on democracy.
Well, I hope you're right, although I think John Keane, who's a professor at your university, would argue that.
Lots of the whole political science establishment believes differently, but what can I say? I'm an optimist.
Yeah, well, we would have a better world if you're right. So
Thank you.
All right, Professor Babones, it was an honor talking with you. We did not talk about much about India. I hope to do that
Next time.
when your book is out. Yeah, next time. I hope you had fun too. All right, like, share, subscribe, and have a great day.